There are moments in history that refuse to fit neatly into the stories nations tell about themselves. Imagine fleeing violence in your own country, crossing an international border in search of opportunity, spending years building a business from nothing, and then watching it burn while a crowd outside chants for you to leave. Now imagine learning that the country where this is happening is the same country your own nation once spent billions of dollars trying to set free. That isn't fiction. It's the modern relationship between Nigeria and South Africa. In 2026, after years of recurring attacks on foreign Africans, Nigeria revealed a number that stopped people cold. 98 of its citizens killed in xenophobic, or as many Nigerian officials now call it, Afrophobic, attacks since 2022. The crisis grew serious enough that evacuation flights began bringing Nigerians home, while diplomats on both sides traded blame over who had failed to protect lives and preserve one of Africa's most important partnerships. This story doesn't begin with violence, though. It begins with sacrifice, with schoolchildren who voluntarily skipped meals, workers who gave up part of their salaries, ordinary Nigerians who believed, without ever having met them, that they were helping free fellow Africans. For decades, Nigeria stood among the strongest international supporters of South Africa's struggle against apartheid. It committed enormous political, diplomatic, and financial resources to a cause it considered not just South Africa's fight, but Africa's. So how did two countries bound together by one of the greatest liberation struggles in modern African history end up here? Evacuation flights, diplomatic protests, cultural boycotts dominating the headlines? How does gratitude curdle into grievance? How does solidarity give way to suspicion? And maybe the hardest question of all, can two nations carry the weight of a shared past when their present keeps pulling them apart? To answer that, we have to go back. Long before the first diplomatic handshake. Long before Nelson Mandela walked free. Long before Nigeria itself became independent. To a time when neither country yet understood how deeply their futures would become entangled. This isn't simply the history of two governments exchanging ambassadors or signing trade agreements. It's the story of two giants whose destinies have collided again and again. One would become Africa's most populous nation. The other, its most industrialized economy. Together they would shape continental institutions, peacekeeping missions, regional trade, and Africa's voice on the world stage. And whether they cooperated or competed often mattered far beyond their own borders. But it's also an intensely human story. A story of students making personal sacrifices for people living thousands of kilometers away. Of political leaders forced to choose between moral principle and national interest. Of migrants chasing opportunity and families displaced by violence. Of a relationship built on contradiction almost from the start. Nigeria would spend decades supporting South Africa's liberation struggle. Then the democratic era arrived, and with it a different set of challenges. Economic rivalry, diplomatic friction, and recurring violence against African migrants that the founding generation of either country could never have imagined. By the end of this journey, one question will remain. Was the dream of Pan-African solidarity betrayed? Or is it simply being tested in ways its architects never anticipated? To find out, we have to begin before independence. Before apartheid became the defining issue. Before Nigeria ever declared that Africa, not Europe, not America, would sit at the center of its foreign policy. The relationship between Nigeria and South Africa didn't begin with presidents or diplomats. It began quietly in the early years of the 20th century. Between 1905 and 1911, missionaries from South Africa's Dutch Reformed Church traveled north into what is now Nigeria's Benue region. Among the Tiv people, they established mission stations that brought formal education, new agricultural methods, and medical care. Almost no one could have guessed that these early religious ties would become the first thread in a relationship that would one day shape the politics of an entire continent. Neither nation, at that point, was truly free. Nigeria remained under British colonial rule. South Africa was building the structures that would eventually harden into one of history's most notorious systems of racial segregation. The two societies were moving down very different paths. But history has a way of forcing distant stories together, and everything changed in 1960. Nigeria gained independence from Britain on the 1st of October. For many newly independent countries, The immediate priorities might have been economic development, internal stability, or managing relations with a former colonial power. Nigeria chose something bigger. In his independence address, Prime Minister Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa declared that Africa, not merely Nigeria, would stand at the center of the country's foreign policy. And within that vision, one issue rose above all the rest: apartheid. Only months earlier, events in South Africa had shocked the world. At Sharpeville, apartheid police opened fire on black demonstrators. 69 people were killed. The massacre reshaped international opinion overnight and hardened Nigeria's conviction that apartheid couldn't be treated as just another country's domestic policy. It had become an African crisis. Nigeria's response came quickly. Support was extended to the African National Congress. The country lobbied successfully for South Africa's removal from the Commonwealth. It also created the National Committee Against Apartheid, bringing government and civil society together to educate Nigerians about apartheid and coordinate national action against it. None of this was symbolic. It marked the start of a commitment that would only deepen with time, though at the time, few outside government circles could have imagined just how much it would eventually cost Nigeria, or how deeply it would come to define the relationship between Africa's two emerging giants. Because the greatest sacrifices hadn't even begun. Some foreign policies are built around geography, others around economics. Nigeria's was built around an idea, a simple one. No African nation could truly call itself free while millions of Africans remained under apartheid. What began as diplomatic opposition soon grew into something much larger, a national commitment that reached from government ministries into classrooms, labor unions, universities, churches, newspapers, and ordinary homes. For Nigeria, apartheid was no longer South Africa's problem alone. It had become everyone's responsibility. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, South Africa's apartheid government grew steadily more isolated. Around the world, governments debated sanctions, and international organizations issued resolutions. But resolutions couldn't sustain a liberation movement on their own. What resistance required was money, diplomatic recognition, education, training, international visibility, and Nigeria decided to provide all of it. That commitment only grew more pronounced after the Nigerian Civil War ended in 1970. Rather than turning inward after years of conflict, successive governments expanded Nigeria's continental ambitions. The country increasingly saw itself as carrying a responsibility that extended past its own borders, and apartheid became the defining test of that responsibility. Then, in 1976, events in South Africa turned sympathy into something deeper. The Soweto uprising broke out after students protested the compulsory use of Afrikaans as a language of instruction. The demonstrations were met with deadly force, and images of young people confronting armed police spread around the world. For millions across Africa, the victims weren't anonymous figures in some distant country. They were students, children, a generation asking for dignity and paying for it with their lives. Nigeria responded in a way few countries ever had. The government established what became known as the South African Relief Fund. Unlike many state-led campaigns, this one didn't rely solely on government financing. It invited ordinary Nigerians to take part. School children donated pocket money. Civil servants gave up part of their salaries. Private businesses joined the fundraising. Workers contributed what they could. Families who had never set foot in South Africa found themselves participants in its liberation struggle. The symbolism mattered. This was no longer just state policy. It had become a national movement. Money raised through the relief fund supported anti-apartheid organizations, including the African National Congress and the Southern African Relief Fund. Education campaigns explained why apartheid mattered beyond South Africa's own borders, and public awareness grew alongside Nigeria's international influence. At the same time, Nigeria's diplomacy grew bolder. The country consistently pushed for sanctions against the apartheid regime, supported liberation movements in regional and international forums, and used African solidarity as both a political principle and a practical strategy. That activism strengthened Nigeria's standing across the continent. But it also came with a price. Economic costs, diplomatic friction, and expectations. Because every sacrifice creates a memory, and every memory creates an expectation that someday it will be repaid. That expectation would go on to become one of the most emotionally powerful and politically sensitive threads running through the relationship between Nigeria and South Africa. History, though, wasn't finished demanding sacrifices. The years ahead would ask Nigeria for something even greater than donations and diplomacy. They would ask whether a country was truly willing to spend enormous national resources on the freedom of another people. And the answer would go on to reshape Africa's political landscape for decades. History tends to remember victories, elections, independence ceremonies, the lowering of one flag and the raising of another. What it remembers less often is who paid the bill before the celebration ever began. By the late 1970s, Nigeria had become one of the most outspoken opponents of apartheid anywhere in the world. Speeches alone couldn't sustain a liberation movement, though, and Nigeria's leaders increasingly believed that if apartheid was going to end, moral support would have to be matched by something material. The commitment kept growing. Successive governments continued channeling diplomatic, political, and financial assistance into the struggle. International forums became another battleground. Wherever sanctions against apartheid came up for debate, Nigeria's representatives argued that delay only prolonged injustice. Wherever liberation movements sought recognition, Nigeria stood among their most reliable advocates. Its foreign policy had stopped simply reacting to events. It was trying to shape them. At home, that commitment stayed remarkably broad. The South African Relief Fund kept symbolizing something unusual in international politics. Not merely a government project, but a reflection of ordinary Nigerians who believed apartheid was an assault on the dignity of the entire continent. The struggle had become personal, even for people who had never crossed South Africa's borders. None of it came free, though. Nigeria held onto sanctions against the apartheid regime despite the economic cost. Diplomatic efforts drained political capital. Financial assistance drew on public resources. Again and again, the country chose principle over convenience, which only reinforced its reputation as one of the leading voices against apartheid in Africa and beyond. As the 1980s war on international pressure on South Africa intensified, economic sanctions expanded. Diplomatic isolation deepened. Inside the country, resistance movements kept up their campaign despite arrests, restrictions, and violence, while outside it, sympathetic governments looked for ways to strengthen that resistance without abandoning diplomatic channels. Nigeria remained among the most active of them. Then, slowly, the political landscape began to shift. By the start of the 1990s, negotiations that had once seemed almost unthinkable were becoming reality. The release of Nelson Mandela signaled that South Africa had entered a different chapter, an extraordinary moment for anyone who'd spent decades campaigning against apartheid, and a deeply personal one for Nigeria. Many Nigerians didn't see the transition as someone else's victory. They saw it as the fulfillment of a cause they'd supported for more than 30 years, the payoff of sacrifices made by students, workers, diplomats, and successive governments. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Nelson Mandela became president. Formal diplomatic relations between Nigeria and democratic South Africa were established that same year, opening a new era. The relationship no longer revolved around liberation. Now it would be tested by cooperation. Expectations ran high. Two of Africa's largest, most influential nations stood on the same side of history at last, both claiming leadership roles on the continent, both fluent in the language of democracy, regional integration, and African development. Many believed that together, they could shape Africa's future in ways neither country could manage alone. But history has a habit of changing the questions it asks. For decades, the central question had been whether South Africa would become free. Now a new one took its place. What happens after freedom? Could a partnership forged in shared struggle survive the pressures of economics, migration, diplomacy, and national self-interest? The answer would turn out to be far more complicated than either country expected. Because the years just after apartheid wouldn't be remembered only for celebration. They would also mark the start of a new relationship, one defined not by a common enemy, but by the harder task of simply living with one another in peace. When Nelson Mandela took the oath of office in 1994, it seemed as if an extraordinary chapter of African history had reached its natural end. Apartheid had fallen. Democracy had prevailed. And two nations that had spent decades united by a common cause could finally begin building something different. Across the continent, Nigeria and South Africa stopped being symbols of struggle and became symbols of possibility. Together they held Africa's largest population and one of its most advanced economies, and their combined weight touched diplomacy, peacekeeping, regional organizations, international negotiations. Many believed their partnership could become the engine driving a more confident, more united Africa. The early years bore that optimism out. Formal diplomatic relations expanded. High-level visits grew more frequent. Both governments worked side by side within continental institutions, searching for common ground on issues shaping Africa's future. The language of liberation slowly gave way to the language of cooperation. The struggle was over. Now came the work of governing. Economic ties deepened almost immediately. South African companies saw opportunity in Nigeria's fast-growing market. Nigerian entrepreneurs increasingly looked south toward one of the continent's most industrialized economies. Trade expanded, investment followed, air routes multiplied. Universities, cultural organizations, and businesses built new connections between two societies that, despite decades of political solidarity, still knew surprisingly little about each other. Beneath the optimism, though, sat a quieter reality. Liberation had united the two countries against a shared opponent. Peace demanded something harder, figuring out how two regional powers would coexist. Both nations naturally saw themselves as leaders. Nigeria brought demographic weight, diplomatic experience, decades of continental activism. South Africa emerged from apartheid with sophisticated financial institutions, modern infrastructure, and newly restored international legitimacy. Neither position was incompatible with the other exactly, but leadership is rarely exercised without comparison, and comparison has a way of curdling into competition. As African institutions evolved, observers began calling Nigeria and South Africa the continent's twin giants. The phrase carried admiration. It also carried expectation. Whenever major continental questions came up, economic integration, peacekeeping, regional security, representation in international forums, attention turned naturally toward Abuja and Pretoria. Agreement between the two often strengthened Africa's collective voice. Disagreement risked weakening it. Cooperation held even so. The two governments built frameworks meant to manage their growing relationship, and dialogue increasingly stretched beyond politics into commerce, education, science, technology. The goal was ambitious: turn a partnership born in resistance into one sustained by shared development. But relationships between nations run on more than treaties. They're shaped by people, workers seeking opportunity, students crossing borders, entrepreneurs opening businesses far from home. As economic links expanded, so did migration. Thousands of Africans, Nigerians among them, moved to South Africa to study, work, invest, or simply start over. For some, the country meant opportunity. For others, it meant competition. At first, those tensions stayed largely below the surface. Then the economic landscape began to shift. Communities struggling with unemployment and inequality went looking for explanations. Foreign-owned businesses became more visible. In some places, public frustration started attaching itself to outsiders. The ideals of Pan-African solidarity now faced a challenge liberation politics had never fully anticipated. What happens when the struggle against oppression ends, but economic insecurity doesn't? That question would soon confront both governments in ways neither had expected. Because starting in the late 2000s, isolated frustrations would erupt into something far more visible: violence. Not between governments, but against ordinary Africans simply trying to build ordinary lives. And the relationship between Nigeria and South Africa would never quite be the same again. History rarely changes all at once. More often it shifts through moments that look isolated at first. A protest here, a diplomatic disagreement there, a headline that fades after a few days. Only later do those moments reveal themselves as pieces of a larger pattern. For Nigeria and South Africa, that pattern became impossible to ignore after 2008. Until then, most disagreements had been managed through diplomacy. Now the relationship ran into something far harder to negotiate: violence carried out not by governments, but by ordinary citizens against other Africans living in their communities. In 2008, xenophobic violence broke out across parts of South Africa. Foreign-owned homes and businesses were attacked. Thousands of migrants fled their neighborhoods looking for safety, many of them from elsewhere on the continent. Among them were Nigerians who had built businesses, raised families, and believed they'd found opportunity in a democratic South Africa. The attacks shocked observers everywhere. For many Nigerians, they carried a particularly painful sting. This wasn't just violence against migrants. It was happening in the very country Nigeria had backed for decades through diplomatic campaigning, financial assistance, and political solidarity during the fight against apartheid. The contrast was impossible to look past. A relationship once defined by sacrifice was now increasingly defined by questions. What had changed? Why were fellow Africans becoming targets? And why did the attacks keep coming back? South African authorities condemned the violence, but condemnation alone couldn't undo its consequences. Communities had already been displaced. Businesses had already burned. Trust had already taken a hit. For Nigerian families watching from home, official statements mattered less than the images on their television screens and in their newspapers. The emotional toll reached well beyond those directly affected. The violence returned in later years, and each new outbreak reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Diplomatic protests followed. Governments exchanged assurances. Investigations were announced. But every recurrence raised the same uncomfortable question. Were these isolated criminal acts, or evidence of something deeper? The strain went beyond public safety, too. Diplomatic disagreements occasionally flared over immigration, trade, the treatment of each other's citizens. None of it erased the broader relationship. Trade continued, investment continued, cooperation within African institutions continued, but the tone had unmistakably shifted. The partnership could no longer coast on memory alone. It now had to survive repeated tests in the present. Even so, economic ties proved remarkably resilient. South African companies kept operating in Nigeria. Nigerian entrepreneurs kept investing in South Africa. Commercial relationships often held up better than the headlines suggested, with business leaders, educators, and cultural organizations continuing to build connections even as public sentiment grew strained. It was a reminder that relationships between nations rarely move in just one direction. They can cooperate and disagree at the same time. Then came 2019. Another wave of xenophobic violence spread through parts of South Africa. Foreign-owned businesses were attacked again. Nigerians were among those affected again. This time, though, the diplomatic response hit harder. Nigeria publicly condemned the attacks. Its government evacuated some of its citizens. Diplomatic engagement intensified on both sides as they scrambled to contain a crisis that threatened to overshadow decades of cooperation. The events of 2019 exposed more than another difficult episode. They exposed a painful contradiction. Officially, Nigeria and South Africa still called each other strategic partners. Economically, they remained deeply connected. Politically, they kept working together on continental issues. But emotionally, something had shifted. For many ordinary Nigerians, memories of solidarity during the anti-apartheid struggle were now competing with memories of repeated attacks on fellow Africans. The relationship had entered its most complicated chapter yet, not because diplomacy had failed, but because diplomacy alone couldn't heal experiences that were lived on neighborhood streets, not inside conference rooms. And as difficult as that decade had been, the greatest test of the relationship was still ahead. Because by 2026, the debate would no longer center on isolated outbreaks of violence. It would become a much broader conversation about accountability, historical memory, migration, and whether the ideals that once united Africa's two giants could survive another generation. If history teaches anything about relationships between nations, it's this: the past never disappears. It waits, sometimes quietly, sometimes for generations, until a single event drags every unresolved memory back to the surface. For Nigeria and South Africa, that moment arrived again after 2020. The headlines looked familiar. Attacks on foreign Africans, diplomatic protests, official condemnations, public frustration. But underneath those familiar headlines, something had changed. The conversation was growing more emotional, more personal, and increasingly centered on a question history itself had created. How could a country that once benefited from extraordinary African solidarity keep witnessing repeated violence against fellow Africans living within its borders? By 2026, Nigerian officials reported that 98 Nigerian citizens had been killed in xenophobic, or, as many preferred to call them, Afrophobic, attacks since 2022. The figure reignited debate across both countries instantly. Numbers alone rarely tell a whole story, but they can force conversations no one wants to have. For Nigeria, those deaths meant far more than statistics. Each number was a family, a business owner, a worker, a student, a life that had crossed a border chasing opportunity and never made it home. The Nigerian government responded by organizing evacuation flights for citizens who wanted to leave South Africa. Diplomatic engagement intensified once more, with officials from both governments continuing talks aimed at protecting citizens while preserving one of Africa's most consequential bilateral relationships. Neither side questioned the partnership's importance. The challenge was protecting it. Another debate unfolded alongside it. Many Nigerian voices increasingly rejected the word xenophobia, arguing that the violence tended to target fellow Africans rather than foreigners in general. They preferred Afrophobia instead, a term meant to capture the painful reality that Africans were attacking other Africans despite decades of rhetoric celebrating continental unity. Even the choice of words showed just how emotionally charged the issue had become. And yet, even through these difficult years, the relationship was never defined by conflict alone. Trade continued. Businesses stayed active. Diplomatic channels remained open. Educational and cultural exchanges kept going. Governments on both sides kept reaffirming their intention to strengthen cooperation rather than walk away from it. The contradiction was striking. Officially, the partnership endured. Publicly, trust remained under strain. Aware of both the relationship's importance and the damage caused by recurring crises, Nigeria and South Africa kept leaning on established bilateral mechanisms to address shared concerns. The Nigeria-South Africa Binational Commission, created to deepen cooperation across trade, security, education, science, and diplomacy, remained one of the main forums through which both governments looked for practical solutions. Its continued existence said something important. Neither country viewed the relationship as expendable. Both regarded it as too significant to abandon, even when disagreements turned painful. That importance reached beyond the two nations themselves. Together, Nigeria and South Africa remained among Africa's most influential states, and their cooperation touched regional trade, continental diplomacy, peace and security initiatives, Africa's engagement with the wider world. When they worked together, their influence often reached well past their own borders. When tensions rose between them, the effects rippled across the continent. Which brings us back to the question that's followed this story from the beginning. How should history be remembered? Should decades of sacrifice define the relationship forever? Or should present realities carry more weight than past solidarity? There's no simple answer here. What emerges instead is a relationship marked by both extraordinary cooperation and recurring strain. A partnership capable of remarkable diplomatic achievement, while still confronting difficult social and political challenges. Those two truths exist side by side. More than a century ago, a handful of missionaries traveled from South Africa into what is now Nigeria's Benue region. Neither they nor the people they met could have imagined the history that would follow. Decades later, Nigeria would place the struggle against apartheid at the center of its foreign policy. Ordinary Nigerians would give money to liberation funds. Governments would spend political capital defending a people living far beyond their own borders. And when democracy finally arrived in South Africa, many believed the story had reached its happy ending. History, of course, rarely ends where we expect. The democratic era didn't erase the relationship. It transformed it. The questions changed. Liberation gave way to leadership. Solidarity gave way to partnership. Partnership ran into competition. Competition was tested by migration, economics, and recurring violence. Yet through every disagreement, one fact held steady. Neither Nigeria nor South Africa chose to walk away. What emerges is a record of repeated diplomatic engagement, continued institutional cooperation, expanding economic ties, and ongoing efforts to preserve a relationship both countries still consider strategically vital. Maybe that's the real story. Not that the relationship failed, and not that it fulfilled every hope placed on it, but that it keeps wrestling with the difficult transition from shared struggle to shared responsibility. History can inspire. It can also create expectations that later generations struggle to meet. Whether Nigeria and South Africa are ultimately remembered as rivals, partners, or something more complicated may depend less on the sacrifices of the past than on the choices still waiting to be made. Because liberation can free a nation, but preserving trust between nations is work that never truly ends.